gathering. It's Galaxy Mew, and I'm here with a Warriors map interview video that you're not going to want to miss. Before we do a deep dive, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Dragon Wolf Works content is amazing, and make sure to ring that bell so you never miss out on the latest animation and map content Rook has. Today, well, we're interviewing Dragon Wolf Rook, a fantastic animator and map host.
Hello.
I'm super excited about today's content because we get to do a deep dive into map production, and trust me, you don't want to click away. Before we get started, give it a thumbs up again if you haven't already, and if you're excited for the interview. If you have any questions, thoughts throughout the video, drop them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you guys. So, Rook, what do we have today?
Well, I have some behind-the-scenes content I wanted to share with everyone today. A lot of work goes on behind the scenes of multi-animator projects, and folks don't normally get to see how a project begins and what that looks like. And I know you had some questions for me about map hosting, as well as some experiences that I had specifically with Next Up Forever, so I hope we can answer some of those questions as well.
Wonderful. And just to start off, what inspired you to make Next Up Forever?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I've loved Warriors and Warrior Cat since I was a kid. I'm old enough to have read the earliest books, and I used to animate a lot for it back in the day. You can scroll down in my YouTube channel, all of it's still there from my early years. And that's actually how I got interested in animation as a career, was I had so much fun animating for Warrior Cat's videos that I wanted to make that my life. And even during the years that I kind of wasn't producing that content, I was always watching the projects coming out from this community. And I was always super impressed by them, and especially as they started to get more and more technically sound and interesting as everyone increased in skill and got older. And it was just really fabulous to see, and I really wanted to dive back in. At the same time, I was also inspired by a lot of alternate universe content relative to Warriors. In particular, I read Cushfuddled's comic Twin Shadows, which is another butterfly effect sort of AU, and it made me want to explore an AU of my own. So I made my own AU where the butterfly effect was swapping Scourge and Firestar as their narrative foils to each other, as the first biggest protagonist and first biggest bad. And from there, the whole story grew.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Let's get into it.
So first I want to start with some old character designs and also talk a little bit about the origins, the very, very early origins of the Boon AU, back when it was actually called the TinyRed AU. So,
oh my god, he is so cute.
Thank you. So Next Up Forever actually started with me designing my AU version of Scourge, aka Tiny Frost. The whole AU originally started with me writing out Tiny Frost's story first, and especially discovering how I wanted to write a romance between him and Redtail, which we'll learn more about that in a later video I hope to make someday, who knows when, but because of that the AU was originally called the TinyRed AU, since it was kind of a ship AU, I guess I would call it in that sense. But because of that, I have a lot of early materials for these guys. So this was my very earliest design for Tiny Frost. Then I gave him a haircut, and then he got an even shorter haircut into his final version, which you see a little bit towards the end of Next Up Forever. He makes a little guest star cameo. And my friend Lennis Lynx did this art regarding his haircuts.
Yes.
Lennis Lynx was heavily involved in the early work on Next Up Forever, and I am so grateful for them. They did these wonderful headshots of Boon and Tiny when we were first figuring out the color palette for the map.
I love the eye color choice for Tiny there. I think that cream orangey color actually is quite a nice reflection in the blue.
Right? I love it so much. It's also a little bit of a reflection of Firestar, because he kind of takes that role in the story as being the warrior cat instead of Firestar.
Ah,
yeah.
Wonderful creative symbolism.
Thank you. Details. We love it. So the next character I worked on designing was Red Star, because in the Boon AU, Redtail lives and becomes leader of ThunderClan. So this was a very early version. I was going for kind of like a red panda sort of vibes. Same as here. Here's an early version of Redtail. And this was all before I was even sure how I was going to do star marks, how I was going to make any of this animatable. You kind of see the little bits and pieces that made it to the final versions.
Yeah.
I also knew I wanted him to be fluffy compared to Tiny Frost, but he's also around the same height. He's a short king. They're both short kings. And then we finally landed on our finalized version for Redtail, which he's also, of course, present as Red Star in Next Up Forever when he goes to FireClan for help.
I do like his silhouette, you know, in comparison to Tiny Frost, it really is a very bold silhouette when you compare the two characters.
Yeah, I wanted for all of the characters in Next Up Forever, as much as I could, like, getting a clear silhouette is very, very important to me in terms of character design. As well as being animatable, which we're going to get into that shortly, because a lot of the early designs were not animatable and had to go through a pass to become animatable.
These kind of creative decisions and backbone building of maps is something we hardly get to see, so it's really unique to see it and see the development process step by step the way you're laying it out.
Yeah, so like here we see some of those early sketches to establish silhouettes and things like that. You know, wanted thin and lanky for Tiny and real thick and sturdy for Red, to contrast both them against each other as a pair, but also to, you know, Tiny's kind of blown about by the wind in this story and Red is more solid. So then here I have some materials. These are actually from I would say the very first version of Next Up Forever, in the sense that it was the very first map that was going to be made for the project. And this was before I had storyboarded any of the project, so I was kind of just mimicking things that I saw from other maps. And originally, the very first map in the Boon AU was going to be a Tiny Frost map to the song Words Fail from Dear Evan Hansen. So I ended up actually making a whole map call video that I never released with the following art. At the end of the day, I'm really glad that Next Up Forever was the first project in the whole series. I think it really turned out for the best for it, but I do enjoy this early art.
Absolutely, it's very dynamic.
Thank you. The whole premise was going to be is that in like his final moments before Tiger Star kills him, Tiny Frost and Red Star have like this moment together that is kind of ambiguously in Tiny Frost's mind, where he apologizes for how things all went wrong. You see, it would have faded to gray as we like went into his mind. And then when it was going to go into the past in a flashback to see like how Tiny Frost joined the warrior cat clans, and then when things all went to heck, it was going to get a cool color palette. And then finally end with just kind of the two of them in a void together, which a lot of these elements you end up seeing in Next Up Forever. I ended up recycling a lot of the ideas. You know, having a moment between two characters in a empty void became one of the star moments of Next Up Forever.
And it's a very impactful moment.
Right there, that's the crown jewel of the map. And this would have been the crown jewel of the Tiny Frost map here, but I'm really glad I didn't go with it. The idea was that there was going to be clips from earlier in the map like spinning around them, and that would require a knowledge of Blender that I just do not have at this point.
Yeah. Now, when storyboarding for a project, it's very common, I've noticed, for there to be some really complicated animations. Do you think it's a good idea for the hosts to be able to consider whether they'd have to animate it on their own?
You know, I think that's probably the first thing you got to consider, and that is something I really learned from my experiences on Next Up Forever, is if you're going to storyboard something, you need to have like backup plans in how you're going to accomplish it, and you need to keep in mind the skill levels of your artists. Like there were things going into Next Up Forever that I just boarded because I thought they would look cool, that ended up becoming boundaries to success as we went along, which we managed to vault over those boundaries, and I'm super proud of the team that we had, that we were able to do that. But it could have been a lot simpler had I kept the process in mind beforehand when I was actually storyboarding it.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Yeah. Because you want to, like, you can shoot for the stars, but at the end of the day, if you want your project to be finished, you need to have a way to finish it. And, you know, being able to offer as much work on your own as well as rely on your team is just, it's the dream combination. So while this particular image here, this art here, would have been a really cool idea, I don't think I would have had the skills to make it real. And I do know people who might have had the skills, but it would have been asking a lot of them because it would have been skills and it would have been work. It would have been a lot of work to make something like this work to the standards I would want it to be. Moving on, I mentioned animatability in terms of character designs. And so we're going to actually go through some of the older character designs from Next Up Forever and from that early Tiny Frost map. So this was Dustpaw/Dushpelt's design, which I had something kind of clever going on in here. I did a lot of like hash marks to kind of mimic how people will often draw dirt on characters, which I thought was funny because his name is Dust. But those lines, all of those lines would be so hard to animate.
Yeah.
So, yeah, keeping a multitude of shapes on your characters is going to make them look more complex and therefore more interesting, but it's going to be a lot harder for animating, for your animators to be able to keep track of all of those shapes. That's just time consumed that could be put towards other things on your project. So here's Dustpelt's final design, which has some speckles, which in and of themselves are a little harder to animate, but you know, compared to the old design, I think we ended up with a much better, easier to animate design.
I appreciate that on the side there you have a little guide for how the markings should be laid out, which I think is really handy.
Yeah, if you're gonna have stripes or speckles or spots, having them tied to an overarching shape that can then be animated and then divided up into the pieces, I think is really helpful to the animators as well. Here's the infamous early Tiger Star design with like the most horrendous stripe pattern of all time, not tied to anatomy at all, super complicated, really hard to read.
My hands hurt looking at it.
Yes, we love him. He would be terrible to animate, absolutely terrible. So here is his much better cleaned up and simplified design, which is probably on the upper end of complicated designs as is. But again,
yeah,
we've come so far.
In comparison, in comparison. I do appreciate that you made the stripes on his back a solid block that are then attached to the rest of the body. I think that is very wise decision.
Thank you. I agree. That's probably one of the easiest ways to do tabbies, is to have that solid block, which is why you see it in a lot of designs, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Similarly, here's an early Feathertail/Featherpaw design, which clever idea with all the spots forming stripes, but again, really hard to animate, so simplified that into just a handful of spots that go along the curve of her back. And then there's also designs I had that, while they would have been really animatable, I just didn't like them, which is why I'm really grateful that I had the help of other artists who were willing to create some really beautiful original designs for the Next Up Forever. Which I will say, when you're deciding if you want to go with original designs or not for your project, I personally really wanted to do original designs for Next Up Forever because it's an AU. I wanted people to see any video or any fan content of the Boon AU and automatically know, oh, that's the Boon AU, based off of the specific designs of the characters.
You're hoping that they're iconic then?
I would say yes. That was the hope, and the idea is that we could come up with some iconic designs for Next Up Forever and for the Boon AU at large. This design was created by Kitty with 3 E's, who is in the credits of Next Up Forever when it comes out. She made this beautiful blue star, which absolutely love it. And then similarly, Kitty also donated a Sandpaw design. Here is the original design I made for Sandstorm, which it's fine. I just didn't like it that much. It didn't seem very interesting. The shapes felt weird. So here is Kitty's updated Sandstorm design. Funny story about this specific design. When I first storyboarded Next Up Forever, I had written out the story, I had planned out the story of the Boon AU up to a certain point, but I didn't have all the details. And it was actually during the pre-production, when we were coming up with these designs, that I realized Sandstorm actually wasn't going to make it to adulthood in the Boon AU. She was actually...
Oh!
Yeah, the butterfly effect of that is that I realized it was Firestar who saved Sandpaw's life when they were both apprentices, or when Fireheart was a warrior and she was an apprentice. She almost falls off a cliff during a battle with RiverClan. And I realized if Firestar wasn't there, if Tiny Frost was there instead, she wasn't going to be there to save Sandpaw. And so Sandpaw actually does fall off that cliff and dies in the Boon AU very early on. Yeah, which means that, unfortunately, Kitty designed this beautiful adult Sandstorm here that we ended up never using in the resources, which is why I wanted to show it here, because this is the version that ended up in the resources because she was present in the video as an apprentice.
Well, I love how you translated the design over.
Oh yeah, Kitty had such beautiful shapes in the fur going back that I wanted to retain as many of those shapes as possible in her younger form. So now we're getting to where things started to shift over to Boon and to the Fire Clan story, which I was developing at the same time as the Tiny Frost and Red Star story, but it wasn't until I really found the song Next Up Forever that things started to shift over. I heard the song Finale by AJR, and then I heard the song Next Up Forever, and I was like, oh man, this is a perfect song for either Tiny Frost or Rusty. It ended up feeling more perfect for Rusty's story and how he becomes Boon and leader of Fire Clan. So then I started to shift things over to designing Boon. So this is one of the early designs for Boone, very, very early. Here are also some early designs, which I will kind of go...
My goodness.
Yeah, he's changed quite a bit. I did a lot of iterations, and you can see some elements of early storytelling that ended up getting scrapped. I'll zoom in on these here. So here we have earliest version of Boone in the Boone AU when he was Rusty. Yeah, there are elements of this design I liked, but I ended up going with something a bit simpler, both for ease in animation and nostalgia, because I really love the old SSS Warrior Cats Rusty, and a lot of those early 2009 Firestar designs just had him be solid orange, and I'm a sucker for nostalgia, and I love that era of Warrior Cats content, and so I wanted to channel that.
It was also an easier time to animate the characters.
Exactly! Like having no markings, just straight orange, delicious. Here I was playing with how I was going to have him be adult. This was back when he was still mostly a Firestar design. And then here was where we kind of start to get the bits and pieces that would become Boone as we know him today. The fire scene that's present in Next Up Forever, I knew it was always going to be an important story in the Boone AU because it's where the name Fire Clan comes from. The clan in Two Lake Place I decided to name Fire Clan because of Spotted Leaf's prophecy, fire alone will save our clan. It's still a canon prophecy in Next Up Forever, it's just that Fire Clan is the one that will save ThunderClan.
So you changed it from more of like an individual character. I mean, his actions do change the entire story, but it is his clan as a group of ragtag friends who save the clans.
Exactly. And so the name Fire Clan in story comes from the fire that breaks out at a warehouse when he's fighting Bone, who challenged him for leadership of the Street Cats. It's in that fire I knew from the very beginning that he was actually going to get injured and be scarred in some way by that fire. And that was both to show the stakes of what he was doing, that he actually saved Bone's life and saved the life of other cats at risk to his own life, almost losing his life, which kind of proved to the other cats that he was the better leader. But also it was kind of a phoenix moment of that he was going to rise from the ashes of that fire and physically look different from it. He has been changed. He's no longer Rusty. He is now fully Boone, the leader of Fire Clan. So this design here shows some early ideas for the scars that he would get from that fire. And I also, something you'll see in this and a bunch of other designs, is I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do about the spiked collars, because Blood Clan in Two Lake Place has a very, very iconic design when it comes to, cat collars that are spiked. You see that, you see a cat with a spiked cat collar, you automatically know, boom, that is a Blood Clan cat. And that makes sense for the story of Scourge because he starts studying his collar with dog teeth. And I wanted something similar for Fire Clan. And so I played around a lot with the idea of them using soot to paint actual war markings on them, to do war paint. And so you see that here in this Yellowfang design, that she has soot markings on her to distinguish her as a Fire Clan cat.
Like a football team, huh?
Yeah, like a football team. And to have it so that if you see these cats that are spotted with ash and soot, that you would automatically see that and go, oh, Fire Clan. I ended up ditching the idea pretty early on, but not before I'd come up with versions of the designs for all of them. One, because it would be really hard to animate all of those little speckles to make it feel like it was painted on soot. And also because I realized that keeping the spiked collars would do more to read to the audience the initial idea of the story. And that was something that was really important to me in developing Next Up Forever as a storyboard, is I wanted people to look at it and from very early on in the video see Firestar wearing a spiked Scourge collar and immediately get that idea of, oh, Firestar has taken Scourge's place. He is in the same narrative role that Scourge is. He has become the leader of, air quotes, Blood Clan. And so having the spiked collar as a piece of visual storytelling ended up being more valuable, even if it doesn't make as much sense as it does for canon. The story we ended up going with it is that Bone is the one who comes up with the spiked collar ideas, and he does it because they think they look cool. They think that it makes them all look tough. We have Barley, Boone, and Violet with the war markings, and I was kind of figuring out where they fit into the trio. That's why it says the kindest, the visionary, and the bold and believing. I was kind of, figuring out little symbolisms for them. Which, these are Barley and Violet's early designs.
My goodness, the stripes on Violet. Woo-hoo-hoo.
Oh yeah, the stripes on Violet would have been very hard to animate. Barley stayed pretty much the same, but Violet went through quite a lot of change to get to a nice animatable form. Which here she is, our finished Violet design, which we have both the younger and the older versions here. which I'm very, very, very happy with how this design turned out.
Yeah, I did a part with her in it, and it was very easy to color.
So then here we have Bone. I mentioned him before. He's a very important narrative character, as he's initially an antagonist and then becomes one of Boone's supporters. So here's an early Bone design. I was trying to figure out where I wanted to go with him. And, you know, another version of Ash Painting's idea. Yeah, the soot paint. Here's a design that's closer to our finished design, again with the soot paint. And then here's the finished guy.
I like his final design. I like that you made him look like he is a skeleton, which I think is really clever. I also appreciate how you simplified down the marking shapes.
Yeah, it made it a lot easier to track different shapes across his expressions and things like that. And here's an early sketch that I enjoyed of Bone, kind of showing his relationship to Boone and how he immediately became his top supporter and his biggest gangster-style thug. Like, hey, what are you talking about, my boss?
I could see him with a Brooklyn accent.
He's a big toughie, but he's also a big softie. And then finally we arrive closer to the final version of Boone. And here I was testing out the different markings and different scar shapes. You can kind of, you know, and of course the decision to make him just full plain orange. Which, something interesting here that reminds me though, that something I'm surprised no one commented on it on the original videos. And that would be a change that happened between the original animatic as I released it and the map call. And that was a change in Boone's actual character design, which we see here. And this just goes to show that even when you're developing a project, like, you gotta be open to outside opinions and outside recommendations, because it's just gonna make the project better. In this case, the difference between the original animatic when I posted it and the final map call is Boone keeping his scars at the end. You can see here in the original version he didn't have them. The reasoning behind that in the original animatic is I knew when he died, you know, when Tiger Star kills him at the climax and then he comes back to life, I wanted there to be a visual indication of that transformation. Again, you know, Phoenix rising from the ashes moments, I wanted him to visually look different from his time being dead. And the way that I originally did that is, I guess, kind of a somewhat common way in a lot of media, which is just to have him come back renewed with no scars, no nothing. He's just back to factory settings. And someone in the comments of the original animatic commented on that and said that that probably wasn't the best representation, because a lot of people in real life do have scars, and those are a part of them and those are a part of their stories. And that removing his scars was actually doing a disservice to Boone as a character and to the audience, because it was kind of wiping away that history that he had. And
a fair comment.
It's a very fair comment, and I took that comment to heart, and I was like, you know what, you're totally right. I want to be better than that. I want to have better representation in my projects. So I went back to the drawing board, and that was where I actually came up with the design for his scars to stay, but to come back star-colored, as to be part of his star mark where his 9 lives are signified. It ended up being way better for the character and the character design. Had I kept the original version, he would have just ended up at the end of Next Up Forever looking like Firestar. He would have looked like any old Firestar design. But because we kept those scars and kept that history in his character design, now he's much more iconic.
Yeah, well, you can see that and just know, oh, hey, that is Boone. You know, it is not just a Firestar, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, so it just goes to show, like, even if you're in the middle of a project, like, listen to people's thoughts, and things can always be better representation. They can always end up being better than they were before. Now, you don't have to take every note you receive from people, but always be open to it, because you never know what's going to be the next best idea. And then we land here on the final version of our man Boone Star, with his silvery scars and his star mark, and his incredibly animatable shapes and colors. So I want to go a bit into the pre-production, because we don't get to see a lot of that in map projects. Map projects come out and we see the pre-production work, but you don't really see what goes into that and into creating those, or the ways that those change and develop over the course of production.
It's wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to do this, by the way.
Oh, no problem. I'm really happy I can share some of this stuff for anyone who's interested in how multi-animator projects come together. So here's some of the early environment design for Next Up Forever. This was, if you were in the project or if you looked at the resources, you would have seen this here. as the reference for FireClan Alley, where FireClan has its little base. So I went in, so you see a lot of these sorts of designs here. You know, here was Violet and Barley's den before they move down to the alley. And here's where the battle takes place. But some of the stuff you might not have seen is things like this. I did a lot of diagrams over the course of the pre-production to explain certain camera angles and certain visuals. Because something I really wanted from Next Up Forever is I wanted it to have a really strong sense of atmosphere. I wanted these locations within the video to feel like actual locations that you could walk around in. And that's when you want to have backgrounds become more than just backgrounds. You really need to create sets like these and designs like these so you can get that sense of atmosphere.
And it really adds to the character and storytelling of the map overall. It keeps it feeling grounded, I've noticed, from what I've been seeing.
Exactly. Really, it gives a sense of style to the map. It grounds it in kind of a sense of reality. It makes Two Leg Place a place that you might visit. So here I have just the first night dumpster alley. I show where it shows up from different camera angles in the actual storyboard, as well as where I wanted the light direction to go and stuff like that. Here's another design that is just the color design and set design for the interior of the warehouse where the fight with Bone takes place before it catches on fire. This one had probably one of the bigger diagrams associated with it. I planned out the whole building.
That's really cool, though.
Thank you. Planning out the whole building meant that even though the camera was going to exist in different places across different shots, it could still feel consistent as if it's all part of the same place. And you'll notice in a lot of these little doodles is I often will draw in, it's a little hard to see, but right here you can see the camera and the little drawings of these two circling each other, or the camera here as he leaps at him, to show where the camera is pointing and what part of that environment they would want to see. So if you see here, these two storyboards here just kind of have generic StarClan characters singing to Boone in this section. And one change that we made during production, early production, was deciding that we wanted these to actually be characters who in another life would have been friends of Firestar. But unfortunately in the Boone AU passed on early, so they never did get the chance to meet him in that way. But they can still be here and support him from StarClan in this other way that life could have gone. And so this is some color keys I did really early on to show pick which characters went where for taking those spots. So we've got Gray Stripe, Sandpaw, Blue Star, and then Tall Star and Spotted Leaf. So something else that happened in the production as well was other instances where I created new diagrams and new pieces of materials to collaborate with other artists and clarify things that I hadn't thought of earlier on in pre-production. I did this little doodle to show where the camera would be in this part and what of the background would be visible on it. Here was a bunch of diagrams I did to clarify the set for when the roof was caving in and the warehouse was on fire during that scene. This one was because the original background in the storyboard was not clear at all, but I really wanted a sense of space for this particular shot. So we ended up doing a lot of clarifying designs for this and actually deciding where in the city this location was located. It's actually next to a river now, so you see a tiny bit of that in the background now in the final map. And you can kind of see one of those like ship loading cranes in the background there.
You know, it's interesting. I really appreciate the sense of scale. These are cats and they're not meant to be that big, and so you can really tell with this particular layout that the building is, well, human-sized.
And that is something like if you're going where you're going to set your story is so important to kind of keep in mind what sizes are your characters and how are they going to fit into environment. And even if like not all of that ends up on the final screen, especially because maps are collaborative and things are going to like transform along the way, having it in mind while you're collaborating with your artist is just going to help you in the end. So there's also some pre-production work I did that I'll show a tiny bit of that didn't make it into the final resources on the map call because it was actually for the credits map, which happened midway through production, which had a bit of a secret storyboard to it, but here we have the environment design I did for ThunderClan's camp, which I did a lot of these sorts of doodles to kind of explain where in camp things are situated and what sort of like dens would look like from different angles. So here's the medicine cat den under a large rock with a little trickling waterfall. I'm hoping to reuse a lot of these designs and environments in a future Tiny Frost project, but they also might change between now and then if I come up with ideas that'll suit the project better. But again, I wanted that sense of atmosphere too. Like, so even in the credits, I wanted ThunderClan to feel like a place you could visit, and I wanted it also to be consistent with future projects. So you could see this set or something like it in any future project and go, oh, that's ThunderClan. Here's the design I did for Highstones and Mothermouth, as well as this design here for the Moonstone and some reference photos that I got for it. Now
this is an impressive shot.
Thank you. This, I wanted to talk a little bit about this shot, and in specific about this part 68, which is also known as the StarClan Choir collab. This was a massive collab, and so I want to talk a little bit about like what went into this part in general. We'll get to more of this later, but when I was actually designing out which background characters I wanted, I actually found it really helpful to make a guide like this so I could put characters in different positions to make sure that there wasn't like two blue cats standing next to them or something like that. So you could get a nice balanced color palette. Speaking of which, for color palette, the visual design of the StarClan cats and of StarClan itself was something that was really important to me when I was developing the pre-production materials for Next Up Forever. I wanted the StarClan cats to feel very visually iconic to the Boon AU as well. I wanted it to not just read as any other StarClan design, so to speak. So this is one of the early tests where I just took the storyboard itself and colored on top of it. Here's some similar tests. I have a version of StarClan where all the cats are going to be kind of that classic ghostly blue with a white outline. I also knew I really wanted to try and do something with color. And so you can kind of see that here where there's a lot of color, there's a lot of texture on Yellowfang. I kind of like the idea of those nebulas from space to kind of give a nebula look to the StarClan cats. And here you can see some more of that in some of these designs. This also includes some designs I was playing with for other undead entities in the Boon AU, such as ghosts and the Dark Forest, which the Dark Forest never came up in Next Up Forever. It probably won't come up in a project for a long while yet, if ever, but I still wanted to come up with some designs for them. So here I was playing around with the idea of if the StarClan cats were going to be very colorful, then the Dark Forest cats would be very non-colorful.
So playing with the duality of color and brightness.
Exactly, and just using that as symbolisms for the good and evil dynamics of the Dark Forest and StarClan. So here's some more playing with just random characters, and originally, a lot of these designs you can kind of see it. StarClan was going to be very textured, and I was going to actually create a texture file with paint swatches to kind of make them look painterly that all of the participants could use to overlay on top of their characters. But at the end of the day, it ended up not being feasible for a project like this. If this were just something I was animating on my own, sure. But when I was working with other artists, I came to know that everyone is going to use a different software, everyone's going to have different capabilities of their machines, and so not everyone would be capable of doing complicated textural overlays like this. And so at the end of the day, simplifying it ended up being the better call.
Well, and it does make them pop, you know? The textures would have been cool, but I do appreciate just the color palette switch. It's an easy and yet noticeable change.
Yeah. Something also that I really wanted to be iconic was the specific visual design of StarClan as a place. So here's some really rough early things for what the trees and the grass might look like in StarClan. I'm testing out, like, do I want it to be white or silver, or maybe a little bit of color to the wood as well. Because again, I wanted it to look iconic to the Boon AU, but I also was thinking, you know, a lot of times we see in projects that StarClan looks a little bit like this, where it's all silvery and white because it's like they're living on a star, and that's beautiful. I love that. But I also think if I were a cat and this was my version of heaven, that would be a little boring. So I wanted to also make that extremely colorful as well. That's where I ended up going. So like this version, I decided to make it more gold, like it was golden stars that they were living on. And then we really started to cook when I was actually inspired by seeing some fall trees outside my house that were in that kind of in-between stage where they were transforming from green trees to orange trees in the fall. And I loved that visual of the green morphing into the red. I thought that was so beautiful. And I'm like, man, if I wanted heaven to look away, I would want all the trees to look like that all the time. And I thought that would be perfect for the cats as well, because this type of tree would only look like this for a very brief time. And so having this incredibly beautiful like appearance of the trees and have that just be forever, you know, the way that they always are immortalized in StarClan is kind of like the lives of the cats immortalized in StarClan. So, and then we ended up here at this final version where I desaturated the grass so that the trees themselves would stand out more. And that's really how we ended up with our final design for StarClan. And I always had this shot in mind during the storyboard, that the camera would turn around and see this massive tree just covered in StarClan cats singing to him. The process of the characters, I'll show you here. I did eventually land on that idea to take the characters themselves and just saturate their color palette to the basically a primary color almost, and have that be how they appeared in StarClan. Just they themselves are full of color, no lack of saturation from the humdrums of normal life. So Yellowfang ended up very purple. Here are some other designs of some of the more dramatic color transformed characters, such as Runningwind and Clawface. So it was a lot of fun to develop these color palettes and figure out what characters would look like if they were in that super colorful StarClan version.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the steps that I took for the big collaboration was to create a guide on how to turn a character into a StarClan cat. Which I'll talk about that a little bit real quick as well. Just the process of how this became a collab. When I first storyboarded the project, I was not intending Part 68 to be a collaboration. And you can see that in the description and in the script. There is nothing there about it being a collab between a lot of people. I was actually in a voice call not long after production had started, and I was on a voice call with some friends and my friend who was working on Part 68. And my friends were the ones who suggested, if we all submitted a character, we could each animate all of the background characters. Because originally I was just going to tell the person, don't animate the background characters, just have it be an image. Because it's too many cats. But everyone had the idea we could do it as a collab. We could get a lot of artists. We could just have one artist do each cat. And I was like, you know what? Let's frickin' do it. And so then I started compiling materials for a massive collab, and I am still absolutely floored that we managed to pull it off, and everyone's work in the final version looks so good. So just for anyone curious, I thought it'd be fun to show you these materials. If you want to turn your character into a Boon AU StarClan cat, you start with the base, you make their outline completely white except for their facial features, which will still have black ink outline. Anything that's a white outline would then glow, and then you super saturate those colors to just crank the saturation bar all the way to the end. It needs to look like a color wheel primary color.
As if they just walked out of a Disney musical.
Exactly. And then if you make them transparent and add sparkles, that's what the cats look like in Boon AU StarClan. So we ended up, a lot of the characters who ended up in the final version of Part 68. A lot of them are OCs donated by my very lovely friends. And a lot of them I picked because when I shared this, how to make a StarClan cat, a bunch of people in the actual server for the project, just for fun, ended up designing their OCs as StarClan cats. And so anyone who had designed an OC as a StarClan cat, I just went and grabbed them all and grabbed the artists and said, hey, you already designed this character as a StarClan cat. Do you want to be in this massive collab? And pretty much all of them said, yes, we would love that. And so it just goes to show if you want to do something, then do it. And usually people will notice. So something else I made for part 68 was to get that camera turnaround, we needed to plan out each aspect of the background as a separate layer so that when the camera would turn around, it could do this parallaxing effect. And so I just wanted to include this little doodle I did breaking down the actual shot into different layers. Because, you know, you don't see how much goes into planning out something like this, but there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, well, it's incredible to see it. And it's neat to see that, you know, you put so much work into the planning of it, and it really shows that it made it easier for all the animators.
I certainly hope so. I think that's probably the titular role of a map host, is to make things as easy as possible for your artists to be successful. If I'm doing that, then I'm doing my job. Some of the last pre-production materials I wanted to show is just, I did this sketch that ended up not getting used for the final map call art, but I kind of liked how the sketch turned out regardless. I ended up going with a different design because while this one's really nice, it didn't feel as visually, it didn't really tell the story of Rusty becoming Boone, and I wanted that to be very apparent in the actual map call video. And so we ended up going with this sketch, which became this art here for the map call. So one last thing I did want to share is I did have a couple, I was able to find some unused storyboards from the original project. So I haven't shown these to anyone really except maybe close friends. Now, a lot of it's not as exciting as it could have been. I did, for a lot of the process of the storyboard, I usually just started at the beginning of the video and worked to the end. And anything that ended up unused was because it didn't feel like it could flow into what I wanted to come next very easily. So here, I'll show you, this is the original storyboard section. This is what it ended up becoming for this section when Violet and Barley are taking Boone throughout the city. Because introducing it, as I was going through Next Up Forever, there's so many little points of the story that I had to establish in a very short frame of time. You know, I needed to establish that there is a city that they live in. It's a space and it feels atmospheric. I needed to establish Violet and Barley as characters, that they were helping Boone, but also that they were scared of the other street cats in the area. And I needed to establish that there were other street cats in the area who were solving problems with violence. Bone in particular, because he was going to show up later as an antagonist. What, like 5 seconds that I had to establish all of that information?
Yeah, that's a lot of storytelling.
Yeah, and so this was actually a part of the map that slowed it down very considerably in pre-production. Was I probably spent like a couple months workshopping this whole section to find a way that it was going to work to give all that information. So this right here is an old iteration where I was going to have the camera, right after this section, I was going to have the camera pan up from seeing a turned over trash can to then reveal them walking up past a chain link fence and have Bone jump down in the foreground and have Violet and Barley react. Which I like the idea of this original shot. I ended up not keeping it, mostly because Bone is clearly seeing them. And it meant that whatever happened next would involve him interacting with them, whether he was going to chase them off, whether he was going to laugh at them. And there just wasn't a lot of time to have an interaction. Which is why ultimately the puzzle was solved when I was like, I think that they just take him home, and then they see a fight happening from up on top of their roof. So that way they didn't have to interact with Bone, but they still saw him attacking someone.
Well, it's a clever change, and it really works.
Yeah, and sometimes just having a little change like that to where a character doesn't interact with the characters, or they see things from a different camera angle, does a lot to help a story work better. Then there was also some little changes after that point of how Rusty was going to leave the roof after this shot. Originally it was going to be something like this, where the camera was looking up at him, and then it cuts close to him where he has an expression change and then turns away. And then something else that I scrapped after that is in the original version, It was going to cut to black and then cut away to him singing. He was actually going to be lip-syncing the lyrics in that part. So he was going to lift his head there, have a little pan up of him walking, and then have him singing as he looked both ways across the street. But in the end, it ended up not working because I couldn't figure out where to go from here. Which is how we ended up with this version, the final version, where he is looking down from that angle and then runs towards the screen. Definitely ended up a much stronger exit. Some of the unused storyboards are really subtle, really small decisions, and a lot of these decisions happened over the course of making a video, because even the tiniest tweaks can end up having a lot of powerful storytelling importance to them. And this was the earliest version of when he is looking down at Yellowfang in the alley where he just saw her collapse. And in the final full version, he looks down at his mouse, looks up, and then it cuts to him approaching Yellowfang to give her his mouse. And in this early version, he actually turns away. He actually turns away and starts to leave, and then stops himself. Which it's sort of the difference in how the two versions turned out is in this version, it looks like he is going to prioritize himself. He is going to go along with Barley and Violet's belief that it's too dangerous to help other cats in the city. As opposed to in the final version, he doesn't really hesitate to go help Yellowfang. And that's all the pre-production materials that I have to share.
Before we close and announce the release date of Next Up Forever, what have you learned from creating multi-animator projects? And any advice for someone trying to get into it?
Yes, I definitely learned a lot of great things from the experience of hosting Next Up Forever, and I'd be happy to go through those. The first thing I learned, it was so important to have reasonable deadlines that the artists can work around. And when I say reasonable, I mean that they are far enough out and firm enough that the artists can plan accordingly around their real-life commitments. Second thing I learned as a map host, my job was to make the entire process as easy as possible. From making the storyboard as clear to understand as possible, to providing reference materials on the fly, to animating myself on a couple of parts. Which it's also important to have reasonable expectations of your artists and your project. Maps are a team project, and you want to make sure that the parts are accessible to anyone working on them. Something simple and achievable is so much better than the most exciting, complicated, unfinished project. Finally, I learned I deeply appreciate when folks reach out for help. There's so much stigma surrounding asking for help. We tend to be really hard on ourselves if we can't do what other people can do or can't do what we initially committed to do. But the truth is we all have something to contribute differently, and we're all on the same team. Projects flow best when we all lift together.
Thank you so much, Rook, for your time and invaluable experience. For everyone watching, thank you so much for tuning into this very special interview. We could not do these projects without your support.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Now, if you haven't already seen it, the last thing we have to announce is the release date for Next Up Forever. It will be coming out on February 17th, this coming Saturday at 12:45 p.m. EST. And it's part of the 2024 Winter Watch Party. It's releasing alongside of all these other amazing projects, so please come and check it out.
Again, thank you so much. And without further ado, this is Galaxy Mew signing off at this moon's gathering.
Take care.